Russia now has about 19% of Ukraine, right? That they occupy. In November 2022, Russia held about 18% of Ukraine. That means that in 2.5 years, more than 2.5 years, Russia has advanced through 1%, 0.97 of 1% to be exact, of Ukrainian territory. So they're not rolling Ukraine over.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. Today I've had Professor Scott Lucas on the show. We've reacted to this meeting between Trump and President Zelensky, and then Trump, Zelensky, and these European leaders. So there's so much to discuss and go through today. It seems to have been a very positive meeting if we compare it to February's ambush of President Zelensky, so to speak, what we got out of it, what Zelensky succeeded in, and what is left to do. Of course, potentially have a meeting between Zelensky and Putin. Trump says that is now on the cards, potentially within 2 weeks. So all that today on the Trump Report. You can watch us every day, Monday through Friday, on Times Radio's YouTube page, or you can stream us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Professor Scott Lucas from the Clinton Institute at the University of College Dublin, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Maddie, it's so great to be here today.
Scott, you were on Frontline last night with immediate reactions to the meeting between Trump, Zelensky, and then the other meeting with the European leaders. But of course, you also need to show face on the Trump Report as we react to what happened last night. Now, I want to kick off with your immediate reaction. This was a far cry from what we saw in February. So would you call this a success for Ukraine, and would you say it was a step in the right direction?
Not just a success for Ukraine, it's a big win. And I mean big win for Ukraine and for Europe. Whether it'll stick, because, I've been using this analogy past few days. Trump is a yo-yo, and it depends on who's pulling the string. Whether it'll stick over the next few days establishes whether this big win is a lasting win. Let me give you my quick talking points, because when I talked to Frontline last night, it was just after the Zelensky appearance with Trump in the presser, but it was during Trump's meeting with the Europeans, the 7 European leaders as well as Trump. So it's moved on a bit since then. The big win was in part presentation. A lot of people are going to talk about that today. How Zelensky, after being ambushed by JD Vance in late February and then by Trump, after what really are pro-Trump attack, they're not actually journalists, they're attack commentators who are set up to ask questions. The guys like, why aren't you wearing a suit? They were there yesterday as well, but Zelensky navigated Trump. And Trump was in a bad mood when that press conference started. He'd been, spouting off on Truth Social all day. And he was rambling about the media. He was rambling about the Biden administration. At one point, he went on for minutes about the evil of mail-in ballots that are going to doom us all to hell, apparently. And Zelensky just sat there and let him roll with that. Then when the attack guys came in, why aren't you having elections? And Zelensky said, well, our Constitution doesn't permit elections. As soon as we get a truce, then we'll bring, democracy. People will have a right to choose. At which point Trump I think it was a joke. I hope it was a joke, which fell flat, which is, so you don't have elections because of martial law. Well, in 3.5 years, it's like, oh, good. Donald, who's been putting the National Guard out on the streets of Washington and then is threatening to do it on other cities, is saying, maybe I can stick around in the White House by declaring martial law in 28. Fortunately, I think people are so stunned that line died pretty quickly. Anyway, Zelensky's navigating that. And then what he's doing is, first of all, on style points, that letter that he hands Trump from his wife, Elena Zelenska, which is to Melania Trump. Kudos. I mean, what it's going to do is it establishes a bond there, because Melania Trump has been going to Donald and saying Putin's killing civilians. And that letter that Melania sent to Alaska last Friday was about Putin deporting the Ukrainian children. The situation that he's up on charges for before the ICC. And so, you get that connection, which is there. Substance, though, which we want to get to, is what happened at that presser is, I think, 2 key points, because the background is that we know that Putin had manipulated Trump pulled the string on the yo-yo, where Trump is no longer talking about a ceasefire and he's no longer talking about toughened sanctions. So what do? Zelensky and the Europeans, first of all, say, okay, if we're not going to talk about ceasefire, let's set the terms for an agreement and focus on security guarantees. And those two words, they were pushing them all weekend. And for the first time, Trump administration is backing security guarantees. Just in principle, the details aren't established yet, although Zelensky has handed across, a written document to try to establish it. But, here's Trump saying, we're going to provide protection, we're going to be involved, Europeans will take the lead, but we're there. That's a major advance. And if you recall, Maddie, when Trump and Vance went ballistic on Zelensky back in February, that's what the Europeans had been working on. That's what Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron were putting on with the so-called coalition of the willing, was the security guarantees. 6 months later, they think they've got it. And here's the tip-off. Keir Starmer, at the later meeting where the Europeans are present, refers to NATO-style guarantees. Now, that's key. It's key for two reasons. One is Ukraine doesn't want just like, oh, yeah. If Russia attacks, that'll be a bad thing. They had that in the Budapest Memorandum back in 1994 when they gave up nuclear weapons. They had it early this century. They had it in the Minsk agreements. And Putin still went ahead and invaded, right? They want something which is much more binding than that. And secondly, NATO style. You don't say that. Starmer doesn't go public with that unless he thinks they've got it on the way to being locked in. Because that means, of course, just a quick reminder, NATO's Article 5, one member gets attacked, everybody comes in to defend. Okay. Second breakthrough is to get Putin into the same room as Zelensky, to get him face to face, followed up by a trilateral meeting with Trump. And Zelensky introduces it in the presser with Trump. Trump says, yeah, good. And we know Trump loves this because this is Trump's photo op. What that does with Putin is it puts him into a corner. Either Putin has to accept the meeting with Zelensky face to face, in which case he is for the first time recognizing Zelensky as a legitimate president, and he's recognizing that government is legitimate rather than trying to overthrow it. Or he rejects that meeting and he risks upsetting Trump by looking like the bad guy, that he's the one that doesn't want to end the war. So Kremlin hasn't made an official response today. And we can talk about their specific signals if you want. But anyway, Zelensky establishes those wins. Then you get the Europeans who are there, and they're all there for certain reasons. Each of those 7 is serving a role. And Trump doesn't wander off and back into Putin's pocket. He does say no ceasefire, because why would you need a ceasefire when I've solved 6 wars already? Nobody laughed out loud at that comment, which you and I would. They just said, oh, yeah. And they just kept the focus on those security guarantees. And we didn't know why till this morning. Trump interrupted the meeting to go call Putin, apparently for 40 minutes. And it looks like he was calling Putin to say, why don't you meet up with Volodymyr? Why don't you meet up with Volodymyr and then we'll all meet together? So he's working on him to accept this meeting. So at this point, and I do stress those words, at this point, what we've got are 2 things. One is generally, Ukraine and Europe have regained the initiative with Trump. They've regained the political initiative. Secondly, they've begun to set concrete terms in terms of where the end of this invasion lands. And I'll just remind the break on this, because this is the reality for Ukraine. And I know some of our Ukrainian friends don't like to hear this. Zelensky and Europe are pretty much, accepting that you've got short-term Russian occupation in Crimea and in parts of east and southern Ukraine. There will be, however, no legal recognition of any of those areas as Russian territory, and there will be no giveaway of further territory, especially in the northern Donetsk region. But while Ukraine has to accept that short-term Russian occupation, they move closer to Europe and the U.S. economically and militarily. Back to that analogy that I've used with you and with your great colleagues, rough analogy, West Germany, East Germany, Cold War. East Germany goes into the Soviet sphere of influence, But West Germany moves from strength to strength, politically and economically, as it becomes part of Europe.
Let's stay on this security guarantees now. Just before we get into that, I want to just highlight the fact that what you're saying before is that, Zelensky, he wore a suit, he laughed at the jokes, he observed when he had to, he let Trump speak about mail-in ballots, rigged elections, as you said. Clearly, he was more prepared to deal with Trump. I don't know if he had that meeting in Brussels the other day, or he's had further phone calls with several members of the coalition of the willing, and they have prepped him on how to avoid what happened in February, Scott. I don't know if that was your takeaway from it.
Well, I mean, the broader story, Maddie, is since the disaster at the end of February, not just on the specifics of handling Trump, but on the broader of regaining the initiative, this has been a huge story. And I know, and quite often we criticize Europe for moving slowly, bureaucratically. It can be frustrating at times. This is a huge success story of the Europeans working with Zelensky when they've been under great pressure. And I've already talked about how the whole goal was to get the security guarantees. Well, in the past couple of weeks, when Trump was really fed up with Putin, because Putin keeps killing Ukrainian civilians, Zelensky and the Europeans kept working on this. How do we maneuver this to our advantage? But they had to deal with that fact that on Friday in Alaska, this was Putin's last card, his last best card, which was the face-to-face with Trump. And you and I are sitting there looking at it going, geez, Trump just got absolutely crushed by Putin. Well, Zelensky and the Europeans know that as well, but they don't take their eye off the ball. Look, this isn't a lost cause. And what they did is, you're exactly right. They talked about how do you deal with Trump getting back into the White House on Monday, and they also kept the focus on those security guarantees because U.S. officials were talking about them. Because, here's the wider success, Maddie, they haven't been just talking about how amongst themselves. They've been talking with U.S. officials as well. Keith Kellogg, I actually saw him yesterday. Keith Kellogg was actually standing next to a couple of the attack journalists. He was standing next to one of them from Fox TV. He didn't say a word. He didn't really want to be seen. But Kellogg's been talking to Ukraine and Europe about how do you handle Trump? How do you make sure that that we just don't bail out and leave Ukraine alone? And the outcome of this is that Zelensky, and by the way, one other thing, a lot of people blame Zelensky's chief of staff, Andrei Yermak, who is a character who's quite full of himself and who they say didn't prepare Zelensky adequately in February. Yermak's not around yesterday, right? You're not seeing him publicly. Zelensky is there, prepped by better officials, prepped by the Europeans. And what happens as a result? JD Vance doesn't say a word.
Scott, we're gonna get into JD Vance. I'm gonna pause that because I want to give that a lot of highlights. So I want to give a bit of a tease for our audience before we get into JD Vance, because just before we move off security guarantees, you and I have spoken about this a little bit, either on Sunday when we had our first chat after the meeting, or even off camera. Now I want to talk about this security guarantees. This felt like out of the question 6 months ago that you would have the United States giving guarantees for protection for Ukraine. Now, just to preface, we're not quite sure what territory swap or grab has been given. That's a conversation between Trump, Putin, and Zelensky. We know that there's potential for Donbass. We obviously know about Crimea, but right now we're not quite sure. But this is what Trump said. He said, when it comes to security, there's going to be a lot of help, adding that Europeans would be involved. He said they are the first line of defense because they're there, but we'll help them out. We don't know about boots on the ground, but we know he's committed to protection. Now, here is where it gets complicated, because Zelensky clearly doesn't want just verbal agreement. So he goes out to the press after this meeting and he says, we'll have this formalized on paper within the next 10 days, and also said that Ukraine had offered to buy about $90 billion worth of US weapons. So when he goes out to the press and says formalized on paper, it shows that he's not playing around. He's not relying on verbal agreement from Trump and his administration. He is saying, I want this written on paper that can outlast presidencies to come, where I'm not relying on Donald Trump's word today. I'm not relying on the quietness of this meeting together. I'm going straight to the press to say, this is what we agreed on. Within 10 days, this is going to be on paper.
Yeah, I'm going to give you the exclusive story in just a minute. Uh, just before that, though, let's talk about that territory because we need to set that up. Trump keeps talking about territory swap, swapping territory, and this is the fly in the ointment here, because there ain't no territory swap here.
Yeah, swap is the wrong word, Scott, and I think it's an offensive word to be using.
Yeah, and and everybody's not going to say it to Trump's face. They don't want to, lose him. But the reality here is Russia's not giving up any territory. What the question here is, as we mentioned a minute ago, is whether you freeze the front lines where they are, or whether Russia seizes more Ukrainian territory. And that northern part of Donetsk is the key part to watch there. Why does Russia want it so much? It's fortified. It's fortified towns. It's key in terms of support of military positions. So not only if Russia gets it, does it make it tougher for Ukraine to ever get that area back, the east back, but Russia opens up the possibility, as the Europeans have been telling Trump, of the highway to Kyiv if they were to invade again. So I'm going to tell you right now, there's no way that Ukraine is giving up that territory that they hold. There is no way that's happening. And for those people, because I love our commenters, I love each and every one of you who keep saying, Russia's winning, Russia's going to take it. Have a look yesterday, folks, at a report by one of the best war monitors out there, which is called Deep State. Russia now has about 19% of Ukraine, right, that they occupy. In November 2022, Russia held about 18% of Ukraine. That means that in 2.5 years, more than 2.5 years, Russia has advanced through 1%, 0.97 of 1% to be exact, of Ukrainian territory. So they're not rolling Ukraine over. So the territory is key here, because if Trump flips back, if Putin can yo-yo him into saying, no, Russia has to have this territory in Donetsk, that's the deal breaker. And everything collapses. But let's assume for the moment that Trump doesn't go into Putin's pocket on this. What are those security guarantees that we're talking about? And here's where the exclusive comes in. U.S. press is going off on one, which is it troops on the ground? Is it U.S. troops on the ground? Because Americans always worry about sending their boys to places on the ground ever since Iraq 2003. Don't need U.S. troops there. Europeans have said they'll provide manpower. Now, the manpower, not on the front line with Russia necessarily, protecting Ukraine's defense facilities, including the drone manufacturing plants. They've said that for months. If there's a buffer zone established between the Russian zone of occupation and the Ukrainian lines, we'll see which forces are in there. But I suspect, first and foremost, it'll be Ukrainian forces that are patrolling. Now, what do the Americans bring to the table? Intelligence sharing, logistics, engineering, transport, equipment, and weapons, albeit equipment and weapons that they sell to NATO members to then provide to Ukraine. Weapons which include air defenses, if Russia continues the attack from the air or tries to resume them, as well as vital material on the ground. So the Americans bring all that lifting in that you don't necessarily need American troops to provide. You might need American support personnel in there, but that's a different matter from what you're talking about in terms of frontline forces. So that definitely can be brought in there. Now, why do I say that there's a story behind this? Whenever leaders meet, it's not just leaders who meet. They also bring their officials and their staffs to meet. And those meetings go on. And what was happening yesterday, even while these other meetings go on, is that the European and Ukrainian military representatives were talking to the Americans in meetings that were led by the U.S. Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, Dan Kane. Those meetings would have discussed elements of those security guarantees that are being referred to out in public, out front. And here's the tip-off of where you get success politically alongside those meetings. You just referred to the fact that Zelensky said this has to be a binding, a long-term relationship. Remember this line from Trump's presser with Zelensky. This can't be something which is just for 2 years. This has got to last. So the American officials who are working with the Europeans, working with the Ukrainians, get into Trump's ear and emphasize that. You've got to have, this is not a temporary commitment. Now, again, I want to hold out that caveat. Trump is unpredictable. He's chaotic. If the Russians can figure out a way to yo-yo him back, they will. I'm feeling a little bit more optimistic than I would have at any point in the past few months because I'm not sure where the Russian option is to pull him back. And for all you folks up there, I don't think the Epstein files are the way the Russians are going to do it.
Scott, do you think that this move from Zelensky to make sure it was written down was his smartest move yet from yesterday?
I think it's a great move, but I want to emphasize it's a coordinated move. I really want to emphasize that you've got Zelensky as the public face, and we understand why. This is Europeans, Ukrainians, political, military, economic people that are all trying to lock down in a way that they lock something down that almost everybody's forgotten about. The controversial minerals deal between the U.S. and Ukraine that was ripped apart with the February disaster when Zelensky was in the White House, but then it was restored. The importance of that mineral deal is not actually that minerals are going to be given or sold to the United States in the near future. Those minerals aren't going to appear for quite some time. That written deal locked the U.S. into being invested in Ukraine's future economically. So you got that locked down through the written deal. You now have to get the written and political arrangements locked in. And when you do that, then you can go to the table with Putin in terms of a settlement from a position of strength rather than a position of uncertainty.
Scott, sorry, just on the note of this, on this investment in Ukraine, Donbass, if it's handed over, obviously we've got Donetsk and Luhansk. If it is handed over to Russia, as you mentioned, that's considered the industrial heartland of Ukraine. A lot of coal mining, a lot of steel. So is it not in the US's interest to be keeping that with Ukraine? And
a lot of minerals there, potentially. Absolutely right. And this is what, and I think if I remember the latest statistics, I think Russia holds around about 75% of the Donetsk region. They hold almost all of Luhansk. They hold about...
Yeah, you're right. 88% of Donbass, 75% of it being Donetsk, and about all of Luhansk.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's that, but that 25% of Donetsk that Ukraine has held on to after 42 months, that's key. That's absolutely key from an economic and a military standpoint. So again, always remember that while Trump is chaotic and certain, we're not just talking about Trump, we're talking about Trump administration. So you've got to look at the economic, the military, and the political officials and say, are they going to be happy handing over all of Donetsk to the Russians? And they're not. With exceptions like the real estate developer Steve Witkoff, who fortunately didn't say a word yesterday because everything he says turns out to be half-assed.
Scott, let's move on. Well, I've only got a little bit left, and I want to speak about what your thoughts just quickly on how likely you think it will happen that Putin agrees to this meeting between him and Zelensky, a one-on-one, and then a trilateral meeting with Donald Trump afterwards.
I don't know. I honestly don't know because they're playing for time is what they're doing today, Maddie, to give you the latest. So on the one hand, there was messages in the Russian state media, let me get this right, of TASS featuring Emmanuel Macron saying that the meeting could be in Geneva or that the meeting could be in Istanbul. So Russian state media is at least saying there's the possibility that this would happen. On the other hand, Dmitry Medvedev, either because it's a calculated move by the Kremlin or he's gotten into the vodka cabinet again, has gone off on one on social, which is all about the the European warmongers, the anti-Russian warmongers, and they came in and tried to play Trump, but they failed, yada 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 yada, which is a bit of a hard line to take. I'd say watch for the signals. I would say up to now, I ruled this out from happening because I'll come back to the fundamental point. When Russia refers to the root causes of the war, which are their terms for settling, it's not just seizing more than 20% of Ukraine, including these areas we talked about. It's not just lifting the sanctions on Moscow. It's not just keeping Ukraine weak. It is that the Zelensky government has to be removed. They do not recognize that government. Well, Putin is going to have to, either way, if he meets with Zelensky, he's having to back down. He may not openly admit it, but he's having to back down from that. On the other hand, if you reject this meeting, you've slapped Trump in the face. I don't know how you spin Trump on refusing to meet Zelensky, especially, and this is the other element to watch, especially if Russia is continuing the missile and drone attacks, and they have continued the missile and drone attacks overnight. In fact, the overnight attacks this morning, I think there were well, there were a few hundred drones that they fired and about 10 missiles. And that's one of the largest attacks that Russia's had this month. Look, if you keep killing Ukraine civilians, you're going to upset Trump. That's why he started to threaten the sanctions. So I think at the least, Putin's got to consider meeting Zelensky. I keep wondering why he doesn't back off of the attacks. And if he doesn't, what do you do? You give Trump a pony? I have no clue where Russia's flattery of Trump goes next, because they made the big move in Alaska.
They're at the end of the road, the end of the road on flattering Trump, because his patience has run dry.
I think so. I think so. I honestly, and I know, and I'm going to respond to our great viewers out there who come back, and I respect exactly what they say, because I thought Putin can always spin Trump, he can always pull him around, and I respect it, but I don't think that is always 100% given. Like I said, Trump is just simply not in the same position as he was when he came into office back in January.
Scott, just a final question. You mentioned JD Vance. We've got to speak about this. The meeting has been praised as being cordial. It's praised as being respectful to Ukrainians, to the Ukraine leader, and of course the Europeans. It was noted that JD Vance was silent throughout the meeting, and that may have played a part in the fact that it was cordial. One online user wrote, "What a difference it makes when Trump is hemmed in by the adults in the room and JD Vance is sitting at the kids' table instead of trying to ambush Zelensky." Another person wrote, "Things go a lot better when JD keeps his trap shut and doesn't try to act tough." Now, your reaction to this, do you think that the US side came off well in this meeting?
Well, look, fundamental has been that the Trump administrations have been divided for months. And you and I have talked about this, that you always had the pro-Kremlin camp, or which is Steve Witkoff, a real estate developer, or it's been the camp that doesn't have any interest in European security, Vice President JD Vance, Pop Gun Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, and then you've had those that are really committed to, like, no, Ukrainian security and European security matter. Keith Kellogg is one of the key pragmatists, and I think Secretary of State Rubio, I think, is now there as well. Let's very quickly, we'll get to JD, but you'll notice that Witkoff didn't say anything. Good. Pop Gun Pete Hegseth, his contribution yesterday was to make sure that when the cameras were on him, that he was scowling like a schoolyard bully, being tough. But JD, he didn't say anything. And I think here is an interesting, a little bit more complex reading, which goes back to the fact that JD has been having his vacation in England. But when JD has vacations, he not just has vacations, he also does a bit of business. That way he gets the family vacations for free. Yay, ding, ding. And he gets to pursue JD's agenda. Now, what's JD's agenda here? Back in February, it was to say, I know my foreign policy. Europe are a bunch of wet wimps who deny free speech to everybody. And therefore, we have no interest in European security or Ukrainian security. Thank you and good night. However, when JD was talking a couple of weeks ago to the UK Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, the silly shots of them fishing together and catching no fish, surprise. But what Lammy was talking about was he was talking about European security, talking about Ukrainian security to JD, get him off of this position. And then Lammy talked to the Europeans the very next day. What's JD's agenda now? JD's agenda, item 1, become president in 2029. We know that, right? Now, how does JD do that? JD's focus now is not as much in terms of grandstanding, I think, over Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Most of his meetings in the Cotswold were with elements from the British right and hard right. He met Nigel Farage, the Reform Party leader. He met Robert Jenrick, who's probably the loudest voice in the Conservative Party right now. He's not the leader, but he's almost trying to position himself as the de facto leader. And he's meeting other activists who are all the guys going on about the fact that the UK has gone straight to hell because we don't have free speech. Ding, ding, we actually do. And that the UK is giving itself up to those evil migrants. JD's play here is not only does he want to become president in 29, he wants his type of European political parties. And that includes, for example, hard right parties in France and in Germany. But here's the kicker. When I was thinking through this, Maddie, and that is focusing on the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, who was one of the European leaders there yesterday. Quick reminder, why was Georgia there? Well, Trump fancies her, but also Giorgia Meloni, who is a very hard right leader, is pro-Ukraine at the same time and pro-European security. So when Vance is supporting right-wing parties, and that would include Meloni, he's actually got people there who are invested in European security. He can't just simply say, that's it, I'm walking away. So JD has flipped back to being invested into a certain type of Europe, and it's one I don't quite like the looks of. But it is still one where you have to at least accept European security, and that is my stab at why JD is not only being silent, but why he is not as hostile to Ukraine and to support of Ukraine as he would have been in February.
Wow, a very interesting analysis, and I didn't even think about the fact that, of course, Giorgia Meloni's presence was there for a number of reasons, because we had a few left-wing governments, of course, France and the UK government there yesterday. But Scott Lucas, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Thank you, Maddie. Let's hope things don't change in the next 48 hours and we can have a bit of a break before we talk next.